Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our talk this morning, and a special welcome to our Zoom attendees as well. It's a great pleasure to introduce Jo to you. Jo trained as a lawyer, worked in Luxembourg running equity funds, got another degree, and now she's a researcher here at the museum. And some of the results of her research are to do with the Rustic Renaissance. So we heard Sarah Bain yesterday talking about the artists, and this is a very complimentary talk. Jo, you're greatly welcome.
Thank you very much. So as Hamish explained, we're here to talk about the Rustic Renaissance this morning, which is a term that was first used in 1905. Back in November last year, we published a book here at the museum called Rustic Renaissance, the Haslemere Peasants Arts Movement. Very proud to have been involved in that. It was a gift to the museum by a local blogger called Catherine Eyre, who'd done a lot of research about 10, 15 years ago into the area known as Foundry Meadow. So hopefully most of you will know where Foundry Meadow is, but for those who don't, it is an area off the King's Road, what is now called King's Road, and what was at the turn of the 19th, 20th century called Foundry Road. Foundry Lane still exists. It's a small lane, about 2/3 of the way down the road, and opposite the end of which you'll find a couple of black and white houses. And it was these houses in this area that piqued the interest of Catherine Eyre. So she started putting her research together as a blog and then kindly donated it to the museum. And the title of the book that we published with her was called Rustic Renaissance, the Haslemere Peasants Arts Movement. And this was a friendly nod to a book published in 1905 by Godfrey Blount called The Rustic Renaissance. Now, Godfrey was one of what we colloquially know as the peasant artists, and the group that worked at Foundry Meadow, where Catherine lived, is generally known as the Peasant Arts Group. We'll take a look at Foundry Meadow itself. So back in 1890 or so, this is what Haslemere looked like in a map perspective. Let me just see if I can get my laser. So this area here is what was known as Foundry Meadow. It bordered on the railway that passes the end of the King's Road here. There's Longdean Road there. And that little triangle there, you'll find a number of quite quirky buildings, some of which pre-existed on the meadow and some of which were built by the peasant art group themselves. Hungry Meadow, by the way, is based on the Old English hunger, which meant a bare meadow. It was basically pasture land that was quite barren. So there wasn't a lot going on there until the peasant artists moved in at the late 1890s. Eventually they were joined by others, and we'll come to those at the end of the talk. We're going to start today, now we know where we're talking about, this area here. We're going to start today by walking through the chronological development of the peasant art movement. So the man who wrote the book, Rustic Renaissance, was this chap here, Godfrey Blount. So Godfrey was a bit of a creative polymath. He was born in Bagshot, attended Winchester and then Pembroke College, Oxford. He dabbled in theology and then decided to step away from theology and go to art school. So he attended something called the Herkomer Art School in Bushey. And people may know Sir Hubert von Herkomer, who was a fine Victorian artist. Sadly has no links with Haslemere, so couldn't come into Sarah's exhibition. However, we'll try and winkle that exhibition in as much as I can during this, because I helped Sarah with that as well. So after the Bushey Art School, he went to the Slade School of Art, where he met this lady here. Oh, sorry, come on button. Despite the eyes, apology for the photos, which is quite alarming. Don't look at her eyes if you find that quite freaky. That is the lovely Mrs. Godfrey Blount. So Ethel Hine was the daughter of Henry G. Hine. Sadly, we couldn't winkle him into the fine art exhibition. It was currently on display in the 2 rooms to the side here. And not much is known about Ethel other than being the daughter of a fine English landscape painter. She was one of a number of Hine offspring. She had a brother who was an art teacher at Harrow, and her sister we're going to meet shortly. So for many years, Ethel has been overshadowed by the polymath creative husband that is Godfrey. Her sister, however, is a little more well known. And this is her sister here. It's her younger sister, Maude. Again, she married another polymath, but he was a polymath in a different direction. So this to the left here is Joseph King. Joseph King actually has links with the museum. He was the honorary curator of the Peasant Art Collection when the museum opened in the site in 1926. So we're very fond of Joseph. He was born in Liverpool into a wealthy nonconformist family. His grandfather was one of the first people in Liverpool to set up the stock exchange there. So we know they had a lot of money. His father was a doctor. And for a long time, and this goes past Catherine's book as well, until recently, we hadn't been able to work out how Joseph and the family had got down from Liverpool to London, where he clearly went to school and was called to the bar in 1890, having been educated in Cambridge and Germany. We finally worked it out between the period of publishing the book and now. So you guys, this is one of the many new developments that you're going to hear today. Joseph's family actually moved down to London in 1878. So Joseph King's father was another Joseph King, helpfully. Joseph King Senior, we'll call him today. They came down to London, 1878, and a few years afterwards, I've managed to locate these two living on the same street. And that's how they met, I'm assuming. Hampstead was not a big place at that time. When they married, they were living on the same street, and so they possibly met just walking around locally. Maude was living in Hampstead with her father, Henry G. Hine, and her siblings for a long time. We know a little bit more about Maude than we do about her older sister, Ethel. Maude actually published books through the 1880s in her maiden name as Maude Egerton Hine. So if you go onto the British Library website, you'll find two books there which have been filed. One is a book of poems, and another one is called Roundabout of Brighton Coach Office, which is basically a storytime version of her family history. Her grandfather was based in Brighton. Again, we also knew a little bit more about how they had got together and when they married. There is another peasant artist who wasn't a creative peasant artist, he was a financing peasant artist, and he was a cousin of Joseph King's, a chap called Greville MacDonald. He was a London surgeon and becomes loosely involved in the peasant art movement later on, after the period we're talking about now. So he's not included here, although I am going to reference him. If anybody was at my talk when we launched the book, they'll know that I think this Greville MacDonald had a little bit of a passion, a little bit of a tendresse for little Maude here. He writes very glowingly of her in his memoirs and remembers the first time he met Maude aged 18. Now, Maude would have been 18 in about 1883, and these two didn't marry till 1887. So they clearly had a long engagement for whatever reason. And this unrequited passion from Greville carried on. But he recorded the joy he felt at meeting this lovely woman, and also that they moved in literary and artistic circles. So clearly we're getting a bit of a sense of the background that the two Hine sisters were living in Hampstead, and which probably gave birth to their practical manifestations of the artistic life they wanted to lead. There we are. This building here, again, a new development in the last few months. This is the Lyndhurst Road Congregational Church in Hampstead. It's a very big building, and we've discovered that this is where Joseph and Maude married. Now, Joseph King's family were wealthy nonconformists, and this is a nonconformist church. And it has an even more special connection with the King family because Joseph King Senior was one of the founders of this church. So he arrived in Hampstead in 1878, and one of the first things he was doing was getting busy in public life and also religious life. And he helped found this church where Joseph and Maude got married. Also interesting, around the time of their marriage, obviously, they went on honeymoon. And it turns out they went to Italy, which for us was news again. We knew that they'd been traveling around continental Europe, but we've subsequently discovered after the book that they'd been to Italy on their honeymoon, and Joseph has also been as far as Canada and America, which opens up incredible research opportunities for us, because we're still not quite sure what he was doing there. But we know clearly that he had sufficient money and leisure time to go off on the boat and head off to the continent and further afield. So just following the life of Joseph and Maude after they got married here, Joseph King Jr. was following the footsteps of his father, who after he'd given up medicine became very heavily involved in public works. Joseph King Jr., our one, did the same when he arrived as an adult in Hampstead. So he was involved on the poor law boards and all manner of good works. And he pops up in newspapers as being a great fundraiser and a big contributor to the life of Hampstead. His brother Ernest was also a JP and on the board of the Poor Law Guardians. For those who aren't familiar with that, they administered the money and the activities of the poor up until the 1930s. So we're beginning to get a view of a family that's very much socially aware and socially responsible, and are doing more than just being aware. They're actually getting involved quite heavily in the life of their village. And we begin to see how the movement that grew in Haslemere could be a sort of onwards development of that social responsibility. So after he got married, Joseph decided that he, after he qualified as a barrister as well, he decided to stand as an MP, and he chose as his election territory Lymington in the New Forest. Seems quite a random selection on the face of it, but we know that his brother Ernest, the JP, was living down in Lymington in a place called Wainsford. Joseph, again, as I mentioned just now, was big into good works. He also had Lutyens staying with him in the 1901 census. So these people had a sense of art and lived and breathed the art and architecture and that kind of lifestyle with those kind of people, it would seem, because we have constant mixes with writers and artists in various branches of the family. So Joseph also, you'll see from the last note, was involved with something called Mansfield House in Canning Town. Now, for those who were aware of the sort of the settlement movement, it started in the 1880s, and it was a view to send university students out to impoverished urban areas, and they would live in those and basically help alleviate poverty, unemployment, and inequality. So I wondered why Joseph was involved with something called Mansfield House. Mansfield College is an Oxford college, and Joseph was educated at Cambridge, and those two should not cross. What I then discovered was that Mansfield House actually began as a non-conformist college in Birmingham, and it moved down to Oxford in 1886, so it had been very newly established there. And this was just an extension of Joseph's good work. He overcame the light blue, dark blue prejudices just to get involved in something that would help lift the poor out of their quite difficult lives at that time. So interestingly, the settlement movement began with the Toynbee settlement in East London in the 1880s. And we have another link because a lady who we'll touch upon later called Catherine Jones, her sister actually worked at the Toynbee settlement in later, a couple of decades later, actually, as an accountant. So it's interesting to see the consistent links between the people involved here and other politically correct right-on organisations that were being established at the same time. So while Joseph was hanging around Hampstead, we start to see Godfrey on the move. So we had Godfrey in Compton at the Limes here in 1890, that's on the electoral rolls. And recent correspondence with somebody who volunteers at the Watts Gallery has led us to believe that he was there actually earlier, so he could have been there from 1888 to 1890. Now, the obvious link, if you're a sort of an art historian, with Compton is the Watts family who lived there. But interestingly, GF and Mary Watts only had Limnesleys built as a proper holiday autumn-winter residence in 1891. I do believe that they were visiting, but we can't really peg Godfrey being in Compton on the link with the Watts, although they do follow similar lines in various parts of their life because they were both on the committee of something called the Healthy and Artistic Dress Union at some stage. So they had common interests, they were in the area. Mary was then going on to set up the pottery with designs that were very reminiscent of the designs that you'll see here and on the slides today. But as of yet, we haven't made a concrete link. They're not in Mary's correspondence at all. So they clearly weren't super close friends, but you know, I'll find a link if there is one. If not, I'll make it up. So we then have Godfrey going to Kirtlington. Now, initially, the working surmise that C.R. Ashby had gone up to Chipping Camden, and Godfrey was just following the same route. But actually, I Googled Kirtlington. It was not that far north of Oxford where Godfrey was at university. So I think he'd almost gone home. He was at a bit of a loose end, trying to work out what to do after his visit to Compton. He couldn't do anything there because whatever he did was going to be overshadowed by the Watts moving in and their grand reputation. So we're wondering whether he went to Kirtlington to see about setting up his own Watts type studio. But in any case, we have him there slightly earlier than we thought, now dated back to 1892. He sat on the parish council, was doing good works, and at the same time was also creating. So this picture here is described in the Studio magazine of 1894 as a chest with repoussé panels. It's basically a very simple wood structure, and the center panel, from the picture you can't tell whether it's copper or something else. I think it's gesso, which is a sort of plastery type finish rather than copper. We don't know that Godfrey worked in copper, so I think that's what it is. And certainly the V&A have a hanging cupboard. It's not on display, but if you go onto their catalogue, you'll see it. It's very similarly sort of bat wooden carved outside with a gesso panel in the middle. So he's in Kirtlington, he's starting creating, he sends a photograph of this chest to the Studio magazine and then thinks maybe if I'm going to need to make money, then I have to go back to London because that's where the money is. So his obituary mentions Bayswater. We have him on the electoral rolls in Bayswater, but he's holding a property which we know at some point in the late 1890s for sure was actually a shop for the Peasant Arts Society. So we think that's the link with Bayswater. But then the next mention is that they're in Haslemere in 1896. Meanwhile, before we get to them in Haslemere, we have Joseph King, still resident in Hampstead, and I've managed to locate where he was now. So this is Well Walk in Hampstead, and he and Maude lived here as a young married couple. And there's a big gap. We know that Joseph was going off seeking election down in the New Forest, so he was constantly travelling. There's a big gap in what Maude was up to at that time. Sadly, the results of my recent research this year haven't been very happy. So I found an article, a small note in a local paper of March 1892, which records the birth and death of Phoebe King. Phoebe King was the daughter of Mrs. Joseph King, and she died within 24 hours, which is incredibly sad, but does explain quite why there was nothing happening in Maude's life at that time that we can find documented. Phoebe was named after Joseph's mother, and for those who had been at my talk before, you'll know that I surmise that Joseph King Jr. married very quickly after Maude King died. I think he's following his father's form, because Phoebe King, Joseph's mother, had died in 1886, and Joseph King Sr. married very quickly thereafter. So I think the King boys were A, slightly rubbish on their own, and B, possibly just serial marriers. So Joseph King had done exactly what his father did, but there was a nod to his dead mother in the naming of the baby, which died incredibly quickly after birth. We then begin to see Maude being recorded in the press. So as part of a display activity, perhaps, Maude takes an interest in Swedish loom weaving. It's quite a niche activity, which I'd never heard of before the peasant arts came into my life. So there we are. We have a picture here of the room at the Swedish Weaving School on Regent Street. So what is documented in the contemporary press is that Maude took 6 lessons in Swedish loom weaving, and she was either very, very arrogant or very, very competent, because she needed no more than 6 lessons before she set off on her own course teaching Swedish loom weaving. So she had lessons under a lady called the Countess Hamilton. So inspired by an exhibition of Swedish industry, which was held on Regent Street in 1893, the Countess Hamilton set up a Swedish weaving school with the daughter of the Swedish consul. Again, recent research has led me to find the Countess Hamilton doing Swedish loom weaving and associated activities a couple of years earlier in Bayswater, and surprisingly at number 12 Queen's Road. Now, number 12 Queen's Road is only 2 doors up where the Peasant Arts Society later opened their first shop in Bayswater. And so I've yet to go down that sort of little wormhole of research to find out if there'd been prior links with the art school, or maybe they thought if they were selling weaving, looms and associated products 2 doors down from an art school, that they'd be a ready market for their purchasing. But it's an interesting coincidence to find very recently, I think last week, that this Danish art school had been 2 doors down from where the artists lived and worked. So Maude found her new happy place in the Swedish weaving, and was galvanized into taking this forward on her own back. And we'll come back to Maude and her weaving after we've covered what Godfrey was doing at the same time. So we've left Maude on Regent Street in 1893. And in 1893, we see Godfrey from Kirtlington traveling around southern Germany. So on the Moselle, the album cover is pictured left, is an album of photographs in the museum collection taken from sketches made by Godfrey. And we have here a photograph of a sketch made by Godfrey. The original's down on the floor if you want to come and see it later. Godfrey, we date to between 1893 and 1891. We have a series of these pictures, and we think Godfrey was traveling out in southern Germany and Switzerland to gain inspiration for his own designs. So Godfrey appears to be an absolute genius designer, but actually if you sort of go into it, he is clearly very, very talented, and they are very stylized versions, however, of what he'd seen before. I'm not saying it's wrong, I'm just saying that he's taking his influence very strongly from what he was seeing in museums and cathedrals in southern Germany at the time. One of our researchers has managed to track Godfrey through his photographs and sketches, and we believed he used the Baedeker for southern Germany and went around Germany on the train. So very environmentally friendly, and was traveling 1893 to 1901 around there. We did know that he and the Kings were travelling in there because, again, go back to Greville MacDonald, the financier who comes in later. His memoirs recall going on holiday with them to Switzerland and Germany. And if we turn now to the next slide, we'll see how this is clearly visible in the work that Godfrey was designing for his wife. So the large green and purple article is on the floor here if you'd like to come and see it later. It's a bed hanging full of vines and leaves in still very rich purple and green. It's a wonderful manifestation in a visible object of the flat drawings that you saw before, and also of the type of things that you see here. On the right hand side, we've got a black and white image. And this is taken from a book by Franz Paukert, which came out in the late 1890s, and it was called Die Zimmergotik. And it was all about medieval Gothic wood carving. And interestingly, this picture on the right here is taken from an article written by Joseph King. So Joseph King was the politician, financier of the movement, but he was clearly very, very capable as well. He was writing an article on wood carvings, very knowledgeable about the history of wood carving in Switzerland and southern Germany, where he'd holidayed. And this illustration was from his article in the Art Workers Quarterly of January 1902. So Joseph, we're beginning to learn, wasn't just the money man. He did have a vested interest in what was going on. So 1893, we've got Joseph looking to be elected. He sadly wasn't, not then anyway. It took him another 17 years. 1893, we see Godfrey going around southern Germany. And this is what Haslemere looked like. Very different. Does anybody want to guess where that's taken from before I illuminate you?
Shepherdstown.
No, but good guess.
Half Moon.
Yes, well done. Thank you, Jenny. So this is the Half Moon Hill. Half Moon Estate was is the subject of another exhibition coming at the museum. Quick plug, Herbert Hutchinson next year. He and his family developed a lot of the houses on Half Moon Estate. So this is a photo taken in 1888. You can see here what was East Street, Petwood Road, and my house somewhere up here. This goes into Lower Street, and this T here is the High Street. And that was fundamentally 30 years after the arrival of the railway. It's still not massive, Haslemere. So when people say the railway caused a massive population explosion, it really didn't. As well as showing you what area the area was like when the peasant artists arrived, you can see when the development happened. So Hungry Hill would have been just like this. There was literally one house, and that's it. Sorry, that's my pencil falling out of my hair. While we're here, I'll just highlight East Street, now the Petworth Road, which we'll come back to, because Hungry Hill was bought by Joseph King from a chap who lived here on East Street. In fact, these here are the houses of Charles Whymper and Walter Tyndale, going back to the lovely exhibition in the two rooms to my left and right. You'll see examples of those artists' work in those rooms, and that's where they were living. It was a quiet village. We don't know why they came here. I have a working surmise, and I'm 99% sure I'm right, but until I justify it, I'm not going to voice my hypotheses any further. What we do know is that Henry Hine, the artist father of Maude and Ethel, came out this way regularly to paint himself. He painted many views of West Sussex, was particularly fond of Cowdray, and the closest station remains Haslemere Station. So the girls would have come out on their family painting trips with their father, got off at Haslemere and seen this massively undeveloped land. So if you want to set up a community, you go somewhere which is quite near London, accessible by train, but has land for sale. And that's what, until I got to my current thinking, that's what we're going with as to why they're here. So the first people to arrive were the Kings. They didn't arrive in Haslemere, they never lived here, but they did work, but we still count them as Haslemere area. So they arrived at Lower Birtley in 1894. For those who know, it's the farmhouse out on the Braeswood Road, just before the garden centre and the railway bridge. So they started there, and Joseph bought land at Hungry Hill and Foundry in 1896, and we know that because he appears in the electoral registers the year after. There was a little bit of delay, so just because we have them in 1897 doesn't mean that was the year they bought the land. They'd have to buy it and then be recorded, and then the registered would be published. So they bought the land, which previously held Puttock's Mill. This is a picture of Puttock's Mill in 1878. The land by this point was owned by a chap called Charles Gay Roberts, and he lived on East Street between Walter Tyndale and Charles Whymper next door. And we didn't know there was necessarily any link. We wondered why, how they got to hear about the land, apart from my secret surmise. And it turns out that Charles Gay Roberts is an ardent Liberal. So Joseph had been standing as a Liberal MP. Charles Roberts was also on the Board of Guardians for the Poor in Haslemere, so they had a lot of interests in common. He also lived between two artists, and you have to remember that the Hine sisters were creative, and they were the daughters of an established Victorian watercolourist. So there is every possibility that Charles Roberts may have been known to the family, and therefore Joseph bought the land from him and began to set up the rustic dream. So while Joseph was buying land to facilitate various people's rustic dream, his wife was setting up the Lower Birtley weaving industry at Lower Birtley. So she was teaching local girls and women to weave. And this moves on from her Swedish weaving lessons. She's had her 6 lessons. She's a genius. She can go off and teach. And that's exactly what she did. And they were really lucky that they were doing this at a time where there were various arts and crafts related organisations that were being developed. So we see the Home Arts and Industries Association that had been formed in 1894. What great timing. It was formed by a social reformer called Eglantine Jebb. And you see through their catalogues various middle-class ladies and upper-class ladies, their names appearing as the organisers of various classes through the country. So we have a very well-established similar weavers and spinning organisation up in Cumbria. But by 1896, we have the Lower Birtley weaving industry exhibiting. They'd exhibited on their own in 1895 and had pieces bought by the Princess of Wales and the Duke of York. Very sweet of the Duke of York, but I've now found out that his wife was also contributing. So I think maybe she was stealing designs or checking out the competition. By 1896, we have the Lower Birtley weaving industry, i.e. Maude King's girls, who were local farm girls from the area. They were joined by the Haslemere applique. So this was before Godfrey had come up with his jolly wheeze name of calling it peasant tapestry. So peasant tapestry isn't tapestry as we know it. It is applique work. And we have here on the left here a fine example of that applique work, which is linen appliqued onto linen with thread. And I've actually got the original down here that you can look at later. So according to the report of the Home Arts and Industries Association, it's only recently been added. So we can absolutely date Godfrey and Ethel now joining the group and their industry by 1896. There's a lovely description here from the House magazine, which calls it coarse, large pattern applique. Yeah, it's not silk work. There were weavers in Haslemere weaving very fine silk at Edmondsbury Weaving Works. It is more coarse, but it's durable and it's beautiful. And they call it bold and somewhat obtrusive. Yeah. But its effective work is by no means loud or vulgar. And I think they really caught it then, because it is actually very, very beautiful. It's very stylized. And I think I lightened it last time to basically a design in a Sharpie being brought to life in fabric. And it's very much has that feel. It's very big and almost childlike, but it's actually very complicated. I was talking to one of the audience members earlier, actually, and we were noted of a piece at auction last year that came up, sold as peasant artwork, and that was actually quite loud and vulgar. So we decided not to buy it. It was what we think. We know they issued kits for the applique tapestry because it was very accessible to do at home. And the lady had obviously not finished her kit very well. It's the kind of thing that I buy in charity shops and then finish for them. So we didn't buy it, but it was interesting to see anyway. But just to show you the kind of designs that were being pictured in the press at the time, we have this vision to the right, which is a simpler version. But you can see how Godfrey is using the motifs that he'd seen in Germany, the birds, the vine and the grapes, to do designs that were appearing in paper and at exhibitions. So the Home Arts and Industries exhibition group, by the way, had some very big luminaries. This was a really big deal for the peasants. The organisation was involved people like Walter Crane, who was an illustrator and artist, and a chap called A.H. McMurdo, who I wrote my first dissertation on, in fact, for my first master's degree. McMurdo was a very little known architect, but did some wonderful typical arts and crafts design as well. So it had big arts and crafts names behind this organisation that our things were showing out. Also, I should note that Joseph King has submitted wood carving that he'd done himself. So although he wasn't doing the wood carving that the peasant artists went to go and do themselves, he was dabbling and retained his interest. As I said, he was giving articles and lectures as well. So we have 1896, Haslemere applique, and this is when we find Godfrey and Ethel Blount at Foundry Meadow. So this is the back of Foundry Cottage as it was in 1877. We have a little outbuilding here, and that's what Godfrey used as his studio when he first moved down. I don't know if you can see just in the corner there, the railway goes across there, and that's now fully developed. You probably can't see those fields anymore. So Godfrey and Ethel moved into Foundry Cottage, and they started doing their applique work there until the peasant art buildings that currently live on King's Road appeared. So they were designed by a chap called Francis Troop, who goes by the name of Frank Troop. Frank was an arts and craft architect. He sadly, as we all will, died, and his partner, even more sadly, destroyed most of his working diaries. So the only things that remained are his first and last diaries, and they're lodged with the Royal Institute of British Architects in London, as are some later designs. But the first diary is really important for us because it does confirm that Joseph King commissioned him to do a number of buildings for him in 1897. So a chap called Neil Jackson in 1980s wrote a monograph of Frank Troop. And bearing in mind that at this point, Joseph King was still living at Whitley, Jackson surmised that the buildings that Troop had designed were over at Whitley. Knowing Haslemere as we do, we actually think that they were designed for Haslemere, because he does reference a variety of buildings, including Cops cottages, a studio, a workroom at Foundry Cottage, a laundry and a weaver's cottage. Now, whilst we don't know where Cops cottage is, we do have a studio, a workroom, we do have Foundry Cottage, that's it, and we do have a laundry and we do have a weaver's cottage around Foundry Meadow. So it is entirely possible that Jackson, who doesn't know Haslemere, could be mistaken, and actually Troop's buildings are here. This is what we think Troop built. So going along King's Road now, at the bottom of Foundry Lane, you'll find a version of this, which is Haslemere Weaving Industry, King's Road, Haslemere. It's the weaving house. It has a sign here, and that's the sign of the 3 shuttles. That sign is actually in the museum's collection in metal. It's metal, currently quite corroded, but it was painted, and it hung outside the weaving house. There's a little sign there that confirms it's the Haslemere Weaving Industry building. To the left here is what is now called the old studio, and that was the tapestry house that was used by Godfrey and Ethel for a while, and it produced the applique work that Ethel invented. So we think that Troop designed those, and they were built not necessarily with any idea of longevity. Certainly, we've got a photo in the collection that shows the buildings in the 1980s when they were being shored up. So they were probably designed as temporary wooden frame buildings, probably similar to the dye house, which you see further down on King's Road, which does look way more temporary, although it's still now a private residence. This weaving house had 2 large workrooms and 11 looms by 1899, and it was recorded in the Surrey Times as being open to the public for visitors. So I can go on forever. It looks like I am. I'll speed up. Anyway, so what were they doing? They were producing this. The Haslemere hand weaving industry produced this in 1898, and it appeared at one of these Home Arts and Industries exhibitions and recorded in the press. And you see here a tree. You can't see very clearly the snake, but if you look at this Haslemere weaving industry leaflet here, you can see the tree and the snake. Some vine leaves there, which clearly reminiscent of southern Germany, and then a legend here. And the legend there, Love Makes a Feast, is actually recorded on the article which I have down here, which is this. So in the version here that was published in the press, this was a white ground and green and purple motifs, and the one obviously that we have here hasn't faded. It is blue. So this is what was being made by Maude's girls at the weaving house. This we know has a clear link to the peasant artists, because it was given to the museum in association with a lady called Miss E. Hoslin. Miss E. Hoslin was Emmy Hoslin, who was a one-time governess of Maude and Joseph King's subsequent child and the only child of the peasant artist called Catherine. She went on to manage the weaving industry when Joseph gave it up in 1933. And she continued the business from the wooden structure and brick structure now building in Waitrose car park, which is called the Weaving House. That's where Emmy Hoslin continued the work. Joseph kept hold of the land at Foundry Meadow and started property developing, and then bought a bigger house. So Godfrey, whilst he was designing, was also establishing the Peasant Arts Society, which was aimed to promote this peasant course, i.e. the rustic, simple life of happiness through handicraft, which he wanted to start at Revolutional. They were preaching this through lectures and publications, but they were commercial. This was an industry. It's called weaving industry. And they set up shop on Queen's Road, Bayswater, 2 doors up from the Danish Art School. And whilst they were dealing with their industries as philanthropists, they weren't taking an income for it. They did have to be self-sustaining. They were selling their items. They had shops. We had one here on Haslemere High Street in the 1900s eventually. Godfrey was also busy writing a book, Arbor Vitae, 1899. These are some motifs from here, which if you have the Rustic Renaissance book, you'll see we used things like this as the chapter headings and ends. Familiar use of the grapes and the vines again, and birds and pomegranates. We know we can date back to a newspaper article to 1899, so the same vintage as this. This is most interesting for me. We know that they're birds and pomegranates because they were recorded in fabulous colours in the press, descriptions, not pictures. The wonderful thing is how it's translated into weaving. So Godfrey did the design, and then we're not quite sure who, maybe Maude, maybe Ethel, translated it into a weaving pattern that he then published in the book. We hold some wood blocks in the museum as well for some of these blocks. So this here, when it was recorded in the newspapers, it was in birds are blue, fruit are red, and the leaves are green. So you can imagine how astonishing this must have been to those viewing it. So we have a little bit of a conundrum about Godfrey's design. I said we're not quite sure how much he plagiarizes. He obviously taking inspiration from other people. But the top lot of images here are all Godfrey over various periods. So you've got 1897 for the two on the left. This is from 1891 in his book Arbor Vitae, and this is from 1903. And peculiarly, I found this one here. I thought, oh, Godfrey, ships, fish, waves, awesome. Let's have a look. It's very similar, but no, it's not. So this is the technical tutor of the House magazine had published an article on how one could produce a stenciled frieze or at the head of a portiere at home. So whether he was stealing Godfrey or Godfrey was stealing him, still not sure. Again, TBC as we discover more, but it's wonderful to see that they're definitely Godfrey style, and he's quite special in that. We see the repeated use of other designs as well. So you saw earlier the snake and the tree and the vine leaves. This is it on a cushion cover. And that's from 1901. And we've just got a picture here of it on the Haslemere weaving industry. So he's using the same designs for both houses. This is from the weaving industry, and this is his wife's applique tapestry. So they were really making the most out of this man. He'd chuck out a design, they'd work it out, do it on both industries, flog it in the shop. Don't tell me they weren't trying to make money. He also did really special things as well that are way more unusual. So we have here the tiny bird that looks like a butterfly. It is a bird. So that's 1901, again 1901, and again 1901, but very different. You've got a cherub here, which coincides with Godfrey beginning to find his own religion, and then the traditional birds, and then the tree here with the bird and the wonderful script at the top. So he did do innovation as well. So we've got the book in 1899, all these happening around the same time, and then Godfrey's moment of big fame. This is the Paris exhibition in 1900. It's the big trade, it's the international exhibition. So England had a trade room. In that trade room was a guest room on behalf of Ambrose Heel. You'll all have heard of Heel's showroom on Tottenham Court Road. Ambrose Heel is a furniture designer who joined the family firm in the early 1880s. And he had his cousin, Charles Brewer, design the room for Heel's at the Paris exhibition. And Godfrey's designed appear on two twin beds there. He did the bed curtains effectively, which the deer that appears on the front of the book that's down there, that's probably a bed curtain. So we know Godfrey was there. It was applique tapestry work, so he was choosing to do his wife's work, not his sister-in-law's, when going to the big show. We also have Joseph King there. So Joseph was still travelling about, keeping his hand in. The quote on the slide at the top there is a quote from Joseph at the opening of the exhibition of the third exhibition of Reading Arts, Crafts and Needlework in 1900. And he mentions going to see the Paris exhibition and the articles from Russia and Norway and how beautiful these things were, the variety of exhibits, and then says there are openings in England. What isn't recorded is the boom, come see my wife and my sister-in-law's work in Haslemere and the shops, because their shops were selling hand weaving, hand spinning, wood carving, leather, and many other useful things. So he may have done the plug. It's sadly not recorded. So Godfrey's professional star was on the rise, and Godfrey's own property portfolio was on the rise as well. So 1900 saw the sale of the Churchill estate. this advert here is the only information we can find so far on the sale of what is effectively Derby Road and Waydown Road. 209 acres were sold on massive plots of 4 to 8 acres. It was owned by the Earl of Derby, who also gifted the land for Braeswood Church. Braeswood Church was designed by Axel Haig. His work appears in the room next door. So why is this important? Well, Godfrey moved to Waydown Road. Now, Godfrey had been an impoverished artist. He'd had his things shown, things were being sold, but he wasn't, as far as we know, aware selling publicly. So I did some more digging, and this year I've managed to find a newspaper article that records the death of a relative of Godfrey and Godfrey coming into an inheritance at the same time. So I think this is when Godfrey made his bid for freedom. He got the cash, the Earl of Derby was selling the land, and so we see Godfrey going over to St. Cross on Waydown Road. Not only did they have a big house built, there's a wonderful description in about 1908, a journalist went to see him and describes the hand-hewn wooden latches with string and the carved beams and the workrooms that were there. He also started planning world domination. So he established his own school of handicraft, and this is a leaflet from the museum's collection about 1901, we think, because it refers to the students at his school being able to live in his old house. So Joseph was still funding him sort of vicariously by letting the students live rent-free in Foundry Cottage on the land owned by Joseph, in the house owned by Joseph. But this is Godfrey doing his thing. So he's setting up the school of handicraft. Ethel begins weaving and teaching as well. So leaves the tapestry house at Foundry Meadow. And Godfrey finally turns to his official attempts at religion. So he founds his New Crusade. The New Crusade is a whole topic of research that we're not quite sure we understand entirely, but clearly Godfrey has always dabbled in religion, but decided that he wanted to incorporate spirituality and religious simplicity into the work he was doing. So he started his New Crusade, and it was partly a return, as it says here, to the simplicity of the country life and country ways. What he didn't know at that point was he was going to set up his own church on Foundry Meadow and start preaching. And at the same time, possibly a coincidence, possibly not, we see some hospitals being built across the railway. They were seen as a bunch of cranks, so it's entirely possible that the great and the good of Haslemere saw the threat of Godfrey in this New Crusade and thought, hey, let's get another church down Way Hill End, and we'll just cut them off the chase, as it were. So Ethel leaves the tapestry house on Foundry Meadow. We have Maude as well moving, and what we do find at Foundry Meadow at the same time is a new manager. We find Catherine Jones there in 1901, and she lives in Honey Hill, which is just off Foundry Lane. It's a lovely red brick building. Again, we don't really have any proof, but we do really know that this was built by Frank Troop. If you look at this article here, this is from 1901 in the Studio magazine. That elevation is that house, and that elevation is designed by Frank Troop. It was an award-winning cottage design, so we think that was built by Frank. Catherine had come down to Lincolnshire, and she started managing what was going on at Foundry Meadow. The reason she was taking over as manager is because Maude was having another world domination crisis. Joseph and Maude had moved to Sandhouse and Whitley. This is a postcard from their house at Whitley, much later, but it was built in about 1902. Wonderful records in the Reba archive on this one as well, but it was built by Francis Troop. And we know from the Reba pictures that Godfrey Blount had done the plaster work in various places in Sandhouse at Whitley. It is very reminiscent of the Spies, and the Spies is an appliqué tapestry work currently held by the V&A. It's supposed to be on show in the British Galleries there. Sadly, it didn't make it to Haslemere Museum. It was given to the V&A in 1953 by the second wife of Joseph King. I think I mentioned in my first talk, it's all about the women. She basically got the hump because Joseph King was spending too much time at Haslemere Museum playing with his peasant art staff. So she decided that after he died and she inherited, she'd give it to somewhere else. That's what I think, anyway. Completely made that up. But why else wouldn't you give it to the museum your husband worked at unless you had a moment of peak? So Joseph and Maude moved there with Catherine. Maude then took her interest away from the weaving house, and that's when Catherine Jones took over. Maude started writing, and she set up the Vineyard magazine, and this is the emblem that is on the embossed copies of the Vineyard. She carried on teaching, and then eventually the Wheel and Spindle Club was set up to continue the teaching of young girls at Sandhouse in Whitley. Miss Margaret Leaf took over, keeping it true to their values. It's another family member, this time a relative of the financier Greville MacDonald, who loved Maud King. Interestingly, in 1902, Joseph writes an article saying in his own living room, he has a weaving loom. So clearly Maud was still weaving at home in Sandhouse. And that's where we leave them. We leave them at Foundry Meadow with Catherine looking after the weaving house here. And this is why I've decided to stop at 1902, because we found this article. 1902, Haslemere is described as the scene of an industrial experiment. Previously, it was a bunch of middle-class wealthy cranks, basically playing weaving, but it clearly wasn't. It's recorded in the contemporary press as A, an industry, and B, it's a trial. And what we think they were trying to do is make people realise how life could be lived in a simple fashion but could still be sustainable. So it's very contemporary with now. So the workhouse was established as a protest and a prophecy. It was a protest against the industrialisation, the move to the towns, and the fact that there weren't enough rural workers living and working in the countryside, living this rustic renaissance. So I will leave you in 1902 with the ladies working, and this is when our artisans of the peasant art movement were being joined by other more well-known arts and crafts artists, and that is a talk for another day. So Hamish is on his way. While Hamish is walking, would you like a microphone? We have got time for questions. Don't need that, lovely. If anybody has questions, do ask. If you have no questions, I'll send you next door. Or you can come up here and see these first. Yes, Christopher.
Remarkable research you've done there, the passion you've shown into everything you've generated is phenomenal. How many people were actually working at the Foundry, do you reckon, the weaving shop? What were they doing beforehand and factoring into this new industry?
It's really interesting. There's a mix. So they started off earlier with basically the daughters of local farmers at Whitley, and then you get housemaids joining them, and they are noted. So I have a portfolio career. Some of you will recognise me from other places, but I'm also working for the Furniture History Society on cataloguing the Arts and Crafts Exhibition Society items, and these guys appear there. And the names of the girls, as part of the Arts and Crafts Exhibition Society, they were really keen on recording the craftsmen who made them, not just who owned the article or showed them. So the names of the craftswomen who appear are often 14-year-old girls to start with, from local families, often the farmers or people who lived along King's Road, the neighbours. And then they would develop into the workhouse supervisors. So a girl called Clara Pammenter, who was a local, ended up managing. And you'll see here 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 girls working. So 7 workers in the article, but they had 11 looms, so they could be having up to 11 people. And after Ethel had moved to Way Down Road in the early 1900s, the weaving house took over the tapestry house, so they could expand, and they had a shop over there. So I would say anything up to, we know definitively up to 11 who were working. They were making pin money, and there is a school of thought that the women were employed as a sign of independence, to give them financial independence and a bit of freedom in their working and financial lives. And there was an argument that this was part of the sort of right on feminist principles of the two founding women. However, later on, in about 1910, we do find an article that Godfrey and Ethel are absolutely aghast that women could have the vote, because where would it lead? So whilst, you know, logically it could be seen as female emancipation, it really wasn't. They only went so far. It was to give them freedom to live their lives currently, but not to empower them to do anything that might hurt their brains.
They paid them a living wage.
It was, but again, I found one article recently that implies it was a very low wage. So there is, it's a fairly left-wing newspaper that does question the level of their salaries. So there's a lot to be teased out still about the working conditions of the women, which nobody's really touched. They've just made assumptions about them having the right to work and earn their own money and taken those forward.
I've got a question about
Yes.
the weaving house.
Yes.
I don't really understand why it was so far removed from the Foundry Meadow.
They wanted a distance between where they lived. It's only across the road.
Well, it's the Waiter's car park.
Oh, that one. Oh, the later one. Oh, well, the Foundry Meadow area was owned by Joseph King. So Maude King died in 1927. Joseph quickly found himself a new wife and was concentrating on his work here, but he was also associated with the Dolmetsch Foundation, where Second Wife was associated with as well. So we think by 1933, when the business was sold, he was losing interest. So he didn't want Emmy Hoslin to be working in his buildings, because he wanted to sell the buildings and the land to fund his new life with the new wife. So you then start seeing the Rhodes houses being built after that date. And we think he was basically selling the land for property development. So after the Rhodes architect then built the string of houses which go from Foundry Lane out towards the swimming pool, they're in the darker brick. So those post-date Joseph selling the land.
So when was this weaving house built?
Certainly, Emmy Hoslin took over the business in 1933. But I have to talk to our local historian, Tim Winter, to find out when that was actually built. I know a lot of the original material was destroyed in a fire recently. Not recently, but within my recent, as opposed to then. So he was very definitely severing his ties with the weaving industry in 1933.
Got more questions? Not surprised with this. Joe covered.
Sorry, I can talk for hours. As my poor husband sitting in front of my nose. If anybody would like to come up and see the objects that are in the museum's collections, you're more than welcome. They are all bagged up, so you're more than welcome to pick them up within the bags. And you can see the Haslemere weaving industry items, and then the tapestry work, and an illustration, original sketch from Godfrey. Yes, Mr.
Joey, you mentioned that one of the enclaves was in purple, white.
Yes.
Yes. Now those are the colours the suffragette choose.
True.
They stood for give votes for women, green, white.
Again, a nice try, but probably 13 years earlier. But I would love it. Genuinely, I would love them to be suffragettes. I've got another working theory. I'd love to find Catherine Jones as being a suffragette. I think I've got her there, but it's very, very well hidden. The suffragette banner, for those that know, there was a suffragette march in the late 1900s. That went through Haslemere. They had a massive banner, meeting underneath the chestnut tree. That would have been wonderful if it had been woven by the peasant artists, weaving fair and weaving free. But it wasn't. It was woven by St Edmundsbury's Weaving Works, who Edmund Hunter started at Foundry Meadow in the 1901, fell out with Luther Hooper, the weaver, and then moved to College Hill. And it was he and his wife, who were very fine silk jacquard loom weavers, that wove that, according to contemporary reports, which is a real shame, because I'd love them to be a bunch of right-on suffragists. So I know, I will get there. As I said, I think I've got a link with one of the ladies, but I will get there eventually.
I just wanted to add Gertrude Jekyll, where the banner, the Godalming suffragette.
That's right, which is in Godalming Museum now. No, so they had stellar history, they had stellar companions, and it would have been a wonderful march to see. We've got a picture of, I think it's the 1913 march, is it? Through Haslemere with the banners on their way to Hyde Park. We are, again, plug for the museum. 1928 was universal suffrage or universal suffrage. So we're planning a museum exhibition for that year about the interesting women of Haslemere who may or may not have been suffragettes. I'll find them yet.
Thank you, Hamish.
As Christopher said, Joe's shown such passion in this talk and so much research, and it's so interesting. And I think it's wonderful that we have these samples of the woven fabrics that we've seen on the slides as well. So do come and have a look at them. So it's our very many thanks to you, Joe, and congratulations on such a good talk.
Thank you.